Welcome to Unsheathed 107. Today we will be reviewing the questions from episode 007 from August 27th, 2009. This is your host, Kit Silver.
I'm Kyell Gold.
I'm K.M. Hirosaki, purveyor of lies and holder of mistruths.
Wow, where did that come from?
It came from a little bit of the rant that I went onto at the end of our previous episode before afterwards a certain somebody pointed out my hypocrisies in action.
I didn't want to do it on the podcast. That seems like it would be rude.
I would never want to have rudeness get in the way of our wonderful co-hosting dynamic.
Our co-hosting dynamic, though, extends beyond this podcast, so I don't think it needs to necessarily be recorded. It's just what part of it makes it onto the podcast itself to be public.
Well,
We
I suppose you're not wrong there.
We control the message. Wow, we have a meta narrative to the Unsheathed podcast now. I can't wait till people start writing fanfic about the Unsheathed podcast.
You mean they haven't already?
I have.
Wait, what?
Yeah, and then I had to read it, remember?
We wrote fanfic about our own podcast and then read it on the podcast.
Oh my god. I can't wait till we get to those episodes again. I don't know what to do with that.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Oh god, we really will. There's a lot of things that we have still to come. I'm noticing that we still have not started calling it the Secret Mountain Bunker as of episode 7 yet.
I thought I saw that come up in one of the previous ones, but maybe not.
It certainly hasn't been established as the thing that we were calling it.
Yeah.
No, it's not fixed.
The blowjobs thing.
We do still talk about blowjobs.
That was early.
Lap nuzzles comes up later.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have our bumpers, which is coming up soon.
Oh,
which
yeah.
I need to figure out some bumpers for the new reboot. And we're actually coming up to, I think we have a live one coming up soon from Rainforest, which will be really, I'm not quite sure what to do with the live ones yet, but we'll tackle that when we get there. But
you'll figure out something.
Too far away.
The live ones are fun because I think almost every live one I go on some kind of mini positive rant about how great the furry community is.
And younger me drank a lot in front of impressionable young people.
Yes, we did. Especially at Rainforest, I think.
Especially at Rainforest. Rainforest was a heavy drinking con.
I mean, they had the buckets.
They did have the buckets. That's where the buckets came from, was an off-site pizza place that we went to that already were full of rum drinks when we got them. And so by the time we were filling them up with rum, it's not like we were starting from zero. It was...
with wine.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
You drank all the rum and then filled it up with wine.
Yes, thank you.
All right, we will do a...
I promise I'm not drunk now.
We'll do a... crap, what is it? What is the history podcast that... not podcast. It's a TV show. They drink a lot. Drunk History.
Drunk History.
Oh my god, I finally got there. We
Derek
will do
Waters'
a
Drunk History.
Drunk Unsheathed History episode where we do get drunk in honor of a previous episode. Man, I'm saying this very
I was going to
slowly.
say, getting me drunk and having me tell old furry stories from 15 years ago is just called Get Me in a Room at a Con.
I still don't drink, but I do get high now. So I would get high while you got drunk, and we could see how that worked. Try everything.
Try aging responsibly.
Like the Pokemon advert that talks about watch them spit roast your friends.
Oh my god.
And I'm just like, I was around in the 90s. Like, spit roast has only ever meant one thing. Like, who was this ad for? Did they know yet?
Please go into a little more detail about this ad.
Okay, yeah. So it's an old ad that was actually in a late 90s issue of Nintendo Power, where it's like catch 'em, train 'em, battle 'em, watch them spit roast your friends. And I'm like, really feels like you're having Pokemon battles, and then like whoever loses gets like, here's my Charizard and my Tyranitar. Like, sorry. I'm just like,
sorry, not sorry.
Sorry, not sorry.
I mean, even the non-sexual meaning of that feels weird in that context. Like,
Yeah.
are you the whole idea of eating Pokemon is one that the lore skirts around. Like there as the generations have gone on,
Yeah.
there's Pokemon that you eat parts of, like Alchemy, which
You can
makes
eat
a
Magikarp. I know
creamy
that.
sauce. Oh, you can
Yeah.
eat Magikarp famously.
Yeah. I think you can have like Toro steaks.
Yeah, so the whole
A little bit of a philosophical nightmare they created for themselves.
yeah, it's weird. Anyway,
do you think spit roasting was a bad translation? Like a translation from a Japanese word that just didn't...
No, I think this was a Western developed and designed ad that just certainly, like, here we are 30 years later and it's hilarious to me.
I mean, is that progress? Spit roasting is a lot more acceptable now?
I mean, if you want to find spit roasting Pokemon on the internet, now is a better time than ever.
I do wonder if this isn't an instance of like the Joker panel with
Right?
laugh at my boner, will you?
Yeah. I'll show them my boner.
Anyway, welcome to Unsheathed 107. We talk about
Woo!
writing and whatever's in our heads.
This is all language related.
It is language.
Right?
You're listening to us because we're supposed to be erudite intellectuals who teach things.
And also we say spit roasted.
All right, we have some good questions from 007. Let's revisit them. One of the ones I'm looking forward to is you guys were talking about your pet peeves in writing. I am curious if those have changed over the years or if you have the same pet peeves. But that's question number 3. Let's go with question number 1.
This is from Athelstan. Don't know how it's pronounced, but I'm going to say Athelstan. It's said that mastery is just a matter of practice. How do you handle the embarrassing writing you produce when you first get started? I've tried writing, and when I look back on it, I facepalm and give up on it. Then I think about my stories I have floating in my head years later, wondering how to get them out. This seems like a recurring theme of writers being unhappy with their work.
I mean, the older I get and the further I get away from the beginning of when I started to do this, you have fewer and fewer feelings about how bad things might have been. It stops mattering as much in your mind because you know that you were a different person than who had different thoughts and whatnot. And also, it's like, I had X number of years less experience doing this, and at that point, it's just illogical to feel bad about not being as good at something that you've spent a lot of time intentionally getting better at in the meantime.
Yeah, and in this episode I talked about Vol and how I'm not 100% happy with my writing there, but that it's very much the product of the person I was then, the young fox who was trying to write his first full novel. But it's also worth mentioning that there are 2 novels I tried to write previous to that I never finished and never published. So part of practice is maybe you don't have to publish everything. You write a thing, you look at it, and you learn from it, and you say, how could I make this better?
Yeah, I made 3 decent cracks at trying to write my first furry novel and never finished that. That was, again, this is when we're talking about like the earliest stuff you're starting to write, and I'm like, I'm gonna write a book about animal people, and then you're like, I need more of an idea than that. It kind of winds up meandering for a while. It's like, and then I can make them kiss, and it's like, what if I make 2 of the boys kiss? Discovering things about myself.
Yeah, and I've written a bunch of short stories early on that did get published, and a bunch of longer work that didn't, and a bunch of longer work that did. And when I go back to it, there's things about it that I like still, there's things about it that I don't, but I'm always still trying to improve, but also recognize, because Vol still resonates with a lot of people. I still get fan letters about that book specifically, not just the Argaea series. And so there's something there. And it's worth recognizing that that's still something that appeals to people. And I think often I worry about focusing so much on the craft that I lose the heart of the writing. So it's instructive to go back to when the heart and the emotion was most of what you were putting into the story.
That's a good point.
And I do feel like some of the early out of position stories have a really good energy that sometimes if I think too much about putting a story down in this formal way, I feel like it doesn't have that energy and momentum.
Yeah, like if I were to go back to Thousand Leaves, which I guess came out in 2007, if I'm remembering correctly, so a little bit before the time we're discussing in the podcast here, but that being my first book, I haven't looked at it in a long time, and I bet what I would most appreciate out of my own writing is there's a lot of really emotionally strained character conflict in that book. And I feel like that would still, like, I'd be like, okay, I see what I'm doing here. I'm making this matter to these characters. And so again, yeah, like while the words on page might feel a little clumsy, I would expect, I think I'd be like, okay, there's hopefully the nuggets of something here. I imagine. Again, it's been a long time since I've looked at that one.
My favorite story about your writing of that book, was how you started with one main character and then you were like, this guy's not as interesting as all the other people.
Yeah.
And he became a side character in the other point of view stories that you ended up making up the novel out of.
Yeah, basically, which is that's another one where there's entire characters, both side characters and viewpoint characters, that got pulled before the final draft. That actually fits into another question we have later on about designing characters for roles, and I can bring that up more then.
But yeah, I guess you handle the embarrassing writing you produce by putting it aside and trying again. Identify the things that make it embarrassing to you. If you're having that reaction to it, then you should be able to say, oh, this is embarrassing because the language is clunky. Well, then you can develop your language better. This is embarrassing because the characters are flat. Well, then research how to make your characters more well-rounded. So you have to get, you don't necessarily have to get the bad writing out. That's a like, put in your 10,000 hours is just a shorthand for saying the more you practice, the better you get at something.
Yeah. That's the big secret.
You
try more.
Right, yeah. You could just have one story that you work on for 5 years until it's as good as you can make it, and you're not embarrassed by it anymore, and then send that out into the world and start the next one. Or you could write a whole bunch of stories until you improve to a point where you're happy with your work.
Like, unless your name is George R.R. Martin, no one is banging down your door to demand that you finish what you're working on right now.
How do you as writers decide your writing has reached the point where you then want to share it? Because there have been some people I've talked to in some panels at conventions who are like, no, I write a bunch, but I don't share it. I'm just doing it for myself. Where in your journey did you then decide to, like, okay, I'm going to send this out. I'm now comfortable doing that?
Gosh, I mean, some of it is ego. You need to have some amount of ego-driven impetus in order to think, I have created art that I believe is worth sharing with the world.
Can you quantify that, though? Is like, were
yeah.
there things that...
Gosh, no, I mean, I guess that's the point, is when you feel in your mind and or in your heart that what you have is a story that somebody might actually want to read and get something out of. At that point, I feel like I'm able to motivate myself to actually get it out there. I'm not trying to necessarily change the world or fix the ills of society, although I, as I get older, addressing those things comes up more and more. That's for sure. Yeah, there's there's a certain something about putting words out there and waiting for an audience to find it that it is scary, but it is very rewarding when people come back and like let you know, like, hey, this I got a lot out of this thing you wrote. And it's like, it's cool to know that words have the power to do that for people.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I think there's definitely an ego component to it. For me, it was having friends that I would talk about books and stories with, and then thinking, well, I have this idea. I want to express. I think the first coherent story I remember writing, the first thing I got published in my college zine, was trying to write a story to express a feeling.
Yeah.
And so it was, I want to share this feeling with people. But also, there's a feeling of satisfaction from reading a good story, and there's a feeling of sharing that satisfaction with other people who have read the same story and feel the same way about it. And writing and sending your work out is trying to chase that feeling, I think, from another direction.
Okay, yeah, and I can see that too.
But like, you can't get around the fact that at some point you've got to say, I think this thing I wrote is worthy of other people's time and energy. And it starts with just your friends. You send it around to other people who have read the same things or who might appreciate the story. Then, for me, I sent stories to the other people working on the college science fiction zine that we started, and they liked it enough to publish it. And as that goes along, you get more confidence. And then you say, okay, a few people thought that this was worthy of their time, so maybe more people will think this is worthy of their time. Yeah.
No? Well, then let me move on to the second question. This one is from Fraudus, another recurring Unsheathed name that will be coming up as we move through the episodes. His question is, what advice do you have for creating a character that can fit a certain role in a story? And we kind of talked originally about what this question was asking. I think we ultimately came down to mostly talk about, creating characters sort of on the structural level of storytelling. So one of the things I was going to bring up when I was talking about Thousand Leaves and certain characters having been pulled out on purpose, like one of them, it was very much a case of, okay, here's a character that was in the book in order to help showcase that, like, oh, there's these bad things happening amidst this group of people. And it's like, yeah, and like a bunch of other people are having that go on too. So this is redundant and adds nothing other than it's another name to keep track of for a character who's barely on page, and then eventually they just died, I think, anyway. And so I was like, okay, I just don't need to waste time dealing with that. I can use those words talking about other characters who stay in the story and do matter. And then also, like, one of the viewpoint characters I had was, again, it's just like, you're not learning anything that other characters can't deliver this information later at a more organic point, right? It's just like, oh, this is just overcomplicating things. It's good for me to know what's going on as the person creating the world, but not all this needs to go in front of the page. And so it's like, all right, you are a character that I am now uncreating for the role, really, or you at least lose your part in the narrative. That character is still in the book that I just don't go in behind their eyes anymore.
Ooh, behind their eyes. So I think I have a better answer now than I did then. We just kind of talked about what roles characters might fill in a story, and then we got sidetracked talking about side characters, which fits. I think my advice is, because of the way the question was phrased, creating a character that that can fit a certain role in a story. My advice is to think about the role you want that character to play, and then think about what background and backstory would have to exist to lead a character into that role in the story. Because one of the things that happens is, in beginning writer stories, is they'll say something like, oh, I need this character to be the ship captain who seems to be friendly but then betrays them. And then they go, okay, so the ship captain comes in and he's friendly to them, and then he betrays them. And that's not satisfying, because it's a plot device with a character skin around it.
Yeah.
But if you think about what kind of person would become a ship captain and would not have qualms about betraying the main characters if they had something to gain from it, what would their motivations be? What kind of events would lead them to want to betray the characters? What kind of person would do that? They would have other betrayals in their past. Maybe there'd be warning flags that the characters would ignore, or would say, well, we can deal with this. But then the result of all that is that when the character appears in the story, you know more about them. They are a more well-rounded character, and when they execute on the actions of the role that they're in, or whatever, when they perform their piece, it's more realistic, because they are a full character with a background and history that you have worked out already.
Conversely, and to tack up onto that, the sort of related question that I've had that reminds me of this one is, how do you decide what species to make your characters when you're writing on writing a furry story? And my answer to that is, absent any other narrative reasons why a character would need to be a certain species, it's most of the time it's, I imagine the character doing things, and whatever species I happen to be imagining them as, I go with that, unless it's a species I've been using too often, in which case I pick a different one.
Yeah, people early on in my career, probably around the time this 007 episode was recorded, told me that I was writing too many foxes into my stories.
That's not a thing.
And I said, I know all those words, but that phrase makes no sense. Yeah. But I did start, and also in the first Argaea books, I did kill a lot of feline characters, which was pointed out to me. So I took steps to remedy that. I made a tiger a main character in a 5-book series.
There you go.
And a fox. I'm never going to not write about foxes. They're great. Foxes are cool. Foxes are neat. If we were all foxes, that would be sweet.
It would be sweet.
How many different kinds of foxes are there?
Oh, listen to episode 007 to learn all about the different kinds of foxes there are.
Oh, we didn't even mention Blandford's fox.
Or the Falkland Islands fox.
Or the bat-eared foxes, I don't think.
Sorry, Odo Scion Megalotus, not this time.
Or the Channel Islands gray fox. Speaking of Euroscience Scenario Argentius.
Damn it.
Question number 3.
Yeah.
Question number 3. This is from Stink Dog, who says, I'm a published writer, but sadly I have not had more than one disappointingly short story published so far. As such, I'm trying to improve constantly, and I figure one of the best ways to do that is to ask some pros what they hate the most in the stuff they read, and to avoid doing those things. In short, I'm curious, so here's my question. What are the top 5 furry writing pet peeves that each of you have?
Let me just say, first of all, finding the things that you hate and then not doing them is just blanket great advice for art. Like, just hearing that again now, 15 years later, and I'm like, man, you kind of got to the core of it right with that.
I do feel like there has to be a contrapositive in there somewhere, though. Like,
yeah,
there has to also be things that are good. You can't just keep doing things and then say, "Oh wait, that one was bad. I'll take it out." I mean, I guess you could. That's certainly a way to go.
also the timing of this is interesting because we talk about how one of the things is like furry ease, like here's like my fur end and stuff like that, and then bronydom came around and the pony speak just became a thing, and it was like, yep, there we go.
Yep.
That's how they talked.
I was going to say, I mean, we can go through the pet peeves if you want, but they could also listen to the episode. We don't have to go too deep. But I was going to say that I guess I've read more published furry fiction than online furry fiction, and I don't see a lot of these pet peeves coming up as much.
I haven't.
People don't say
either.
fur end
No.
in books as much, and I'm not sure why that is. Just the furry writing community has changed, and I think people are writing less in the fandom vernacular and more in a style that
and it's not like, oh, I'm trying to take furry mainstream, quote unquote, as like that was a conversation for a long time,
right.
But it's more like, yeah, like there's more recognition from furries that people who aren't necessarily in the fandom like aren't not into this stuff.
Yeah.
Like once it became clear, like, oh, there's a lot of like horny housewives who like the werewolf porn with like the knots and the sheaths, and it's like, yeah, see, like we can come to an understanding, our two peoples, our two cultures.
There's sort of this is a thing across writing anywhere. Like, I'm not calling to mind what book it is, but there are definitely science fiction books that I've read that have been based around a particular scientific discipline and went way too heavy on the jargon in that discipline.
Oh yeah.
To be comprehensible to me without a glossary or guide. And so the vernacular jargon kind of thing is an excluding factor in these texts. And so I think what's
run
happening
into those, it's basically you're reading, look how much I know about this thing, and it's distracting because it feels like showing off, and it's obtuse and difficult to get into.
And that said, I think if you wrote a story set in our world about the fandom, and you had people using that vernacular, that would be more appropriate because the vernacular is the language of that story. It's the language of that community.
That's true, yes.
And of course, you have the right to make up whatever words you want for your furry world. But this is kind of like the Zootopia problem, where the vernacular that we use in the furry community emphasizes the differences between furry characters and humans.
Yeah.
And so when we say friends, that, like, not that any of us do, but if we were to say, oh, our friends, I would immediately know that you meant friends who are furries, as opposed to friends who are gamers or friends who are work colleagues or anything like that. But in a world where everyone is furry, the term friends doesn't have that meaning. So, like, a lot of Zootopia's puns are puns on things that exist in our human world.
Right.
Which, if you think about it too long,
why would that be funny to them? Yeah.
Right.
Or like,
why would something be called Zuber or Zoogle?
Yeah.
It's because it's funny to us, the viewers, and that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that that's a bad aspect of Zootopia. It is a part of that world that it is designed with an eye to be viewed by us. But the furry vernacular is a language that has a particular use and place, and then putting it into a different setting makes it annoying to me.
Yeah. So earlier, though, like when you're talking about, okay, here's how people in the real world would jargon signal this sort of thing. For me, for the longest time, the euphemistic code phrase for figuring out if somebody was a furry or not was, are they of the hobby?
Right.
So what
Right.
we say is like, oh, is they are they of the hobby? And it's like, yeah, it's cool. It's like, all right, like, it's just so you know how to set expectations.
And in the queer community, people say,
Yeah.
oh, are they family?
Yeah, family, yeah. The Friends of Dorothy.
Friends of Dorothy, right. I learned about that from the movie My Fellow Americans, actually.
Oh, wow, okay. And then Tobias Fünke with White Power Bill.
So the furry vernacular was one. We also talked about paw feet or foot paws.
Foot paws.
And yiffy.
Yiffy. Oh my god, it's so funny. Like, it's that term stays alive with the youngsters. It really does. Like, if you go to places on the internet where that word is used, it's all like, oh, you are brand new, aren't you? Like, this is how you're finding your way into the fandom, and somebody told you what yiffing was and you got here. And it's just like, oh, you are literally like our precious summer children. One day you might have a podcast, little ones.
Wasn't it in the 30 Rock episode?
Oh god. Yes, it was. It's our word for intercourse is yiffing. Astronaut Mike Dexter.
Astronaut Mike Dexter, yeah. Our number 2 is another one that I don't see that much anymore, which is too much exposition about the origin of furries.
Yeah, that was a more turn of the century kind of thing, especially coming out of a lot of late 90s stuff was all about presenting like some new world and like this is why it was peopled the way it was. Like Albedo had like stuff like that. Like a lot of kids shows from the 90s, which then when people become 2000s adults and they have weird funny feelings about the cartoon animals of their childhood, it all converges into this desire to create, and then you're writing stories about foxes and huskies meeting at nightclubs.
And I think this was also a thing that happened a lot when the writing community was young.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the ages of people, but with furry literature as a whole.
Yeah.
Because people wanted to imagine these furry worlds, and they said, well, okay, my furry world starts like this. Because, as we mentioned, furry is not a canonical fandom.
Right. There's no corpus to go to.
And so I think a lot of people felt like they had to establish their own canon for their world before diving into it. But people do not do that so much anymore that I've seen. So good. I mean, what I'm taking away from this is that people have noticed our pet peeves and stopped doing them. So excellent.
I was going to say, I feel like in general, nerds are over concerned about canon as a concept to begin with. Ho, spicy.
Exactly.
The internet made it not fun to talk about Star Wars anymore.
So you did have a couple other pet peeves. One of them, number 3, was furries being better than human.
Oh, yeah, that was a thing where it was, I think it was like the sort of like goth adjacent crowd where it's like not identifying with human society as an act of radicalism, which I think the world itself just got too dark and crummy for anyone to take that seriously and for anyone to attempt it anymore.
Yeah, I feel like I don't see that as often, but there was definitely a subgenre of look how horrible and corrupt humans are, and furries are the pure species that are worthwhile. But again, I don't see that one as much anymore, and I think you're right, KM. I think
Yeah,
times have changed.
I think so too.
Number 4 was the furry species gets lost during the story.
Oh, that still happens.
That does still happen, actually. That was the one I remember when reading through. I'm like, okay, this one is still definitely an issue, and it sort of ties in with the because we mentioned this, like, oh, you keep referring to this character as like the species name here, and I'm like, if you don't do that, I am going to forget, especially if you're not giving any other context clues as to what animal they are.
Yeah,
Like,
and I think in the broader sense, maybe that's now my top pet peeve with furry fiction is where the species become forgotten or seem unimportant. Where it's like, here's 3 friends, and in the first page you're like, they're a raccoon, an otter, and a capybara, and you're like, cool, and then pages go by, and you're like, why was one of them a capybara? I don't know. That was just a species I picked out of a hat on the first page, and it doesn't come up again until
Didn't even poop squares.
that's wombats.
That's wombats.
Wombats.
Capybaras are just giant squares.
They're just
or they're more rectangles, I guess. Rectangular prisms.
trapezoids,
Trapezoids. Trapezoidal solid.
trapibaras.
Oh,
And then number 5 was extended expository. Like the wolf looked in the mirror and saw.
Oh yeah, expository description.
yeah.
I mean, that's just a pet peeve anywhere.
Like,
It's
figuring out how much description to give at a given moment is a problem at every point when you're writing, because you need to figure out where the balance is. Otherwise, if you get too meticulous, it stands out, and it's like, okay, if it took you 2 pages describing what this wolf looked like, and then like over the next 3 pages, like hours of stuff passes, like you have balanced your storytelling wrong.
you chose poorly.
So the solution to that is
So the solution that I usually recommend for that is description and character and setting are best revealed through interaction. So don't have your character stand there while you tell me what they look like. Have your character be doing something, pursuing a goal, taking an action, and then describe to me how the features of your character aid or impede the action that they're taking, or inform the action that they're taking.
Yeah.
Your wolf is going to get a fur trim because wolves in this society keep their fur to a modest 1 inch everywhere along their body, and his has grown so long that it's shaggy.
Maybe your character meets a maned wolf while they're sitting down, and they don't realize until they stand up quite how tall they are. And like, that could be a fun interaction to throw in. I don't know. That seems like a joke you could throw into BoJack Horseman.
Right. But yeah, give the reader the description that they need to understand what's going on in that moment. You have to give identifying features like character is a wolf and is average height, or they were tall for a wolf, they were short for a wolf, but even then, they had to duck to go through
They were
doorways.
average height for tapestries at 6'4".
They had to duck going through doorways, or they had to scrunch up to fit in the train seat, or they could never reach the 25th floor button on the elevator, or things that affect their interactions with their environment are more interesting than just he was 6'4". And if you have to just say he was 6'4", then say that made these things difficult. It made other things easy. He was always getting things off top shelves for his little friends. He was banging his head on light fixtures.
3 or 4 years ago now that I wrote an erotic piece of furry writing for the first time in a while. And like, one of the things that I was doing with it, I'm like, okay, this isn't like fat fur fetishism as a kink, but as part of the story. It's like, yeah, fat people have sex too. Some people are overweight, and we bang. Like, and it doesn't need to be about that. But I also don't need to like obfuscate that that's what's going on. Like,
Right. Yeah.
I was amused. We were at some friends having a game night on Saturday, and there was a chandelier in the middle of the dining room, and one of the other individuals kept banging their head against it. It was
Multiple
comedic in the sense
times.
that after at much human civilization, we've reached the point, furry or non-furry, people will still bump their heads into chandeliers while doing normal things.
I
had
will.
one of my writing instructors at one point who was beyond 6 foot. I don't know how tall they
Somewhere
were
up there.
exactly, but they had an extended rant about how society is not built for tall people and how they constantly had to duck in certain doorways and they would bang their heads because light fixtures were too low and they couldn't fit in airplane seats and cars weren't made properly for them. And it was a very entertaining, like, multiple minutes long rant. And on one of the websites I read, someone had a question about how tall is so tall as to be uncomfortable. And the answer to that was they think 6'4" is the tallest height where you don't start banging your head on things. If you get up to like 6'5", 6'8", then you're going to start running into things that were not designed for you and cars that don't fit you and other stuff like that. But they said 6'4" feels like the tallest comfortable height.
Was that globally or Western?
I definitely had more height issues when I lived in Japan.
Oh yeah, that was Western for sure.
Yeah, like,
and specifically United States.
Definitely had
probably.
to duck through a lot of doors in Japan.
Yeah, great details to add to your world when you're writing it. All right.
Yep.
We have 2 new questions we are going to do tonight.
Yeah.
Or today.
I guess I will start with the first one, which is from Michael Evans, who asks, how long do you sit in that idea before you decide to put it on paper? Oh God, years sometimes in my case. I have an entire, like, half of a book idea that I keep working on in my head, and I just haven't gotten any words down.
Is that Catherine's book?
No, this is a different book. This is
you've told me about
the one I've
told
told
me
you
about
this one, yeah.
You've told me about that one too.
I do also need to write Catherine's book, and I need to finish writing the other weird subversive book that I mentioned before. The one that I've read sections of it on my Twitch stream to I guess upload.
Yeah, it depends on how long the story's going to be. If it's a short story, then not very long, because I would rather just write it out and see how it goes, and it's a couple days work lost if it's not going to go anywhere. For longer works, so funny story, we were talking about Trello boards lately, and because Kit wanted to be able to keep track of some of the projects I'm working on, and I remembered, oh, right, I made a Trello board for myself. And I went and looked it up and hadn't updated it in a year or more. So it was interesting looking at the future projects list, where I would be going down the list and like, oh, that one's done. That one I still want to write, but I haven't started yet. I don't remember anything about that one. So normally if it's going to be a novel, I will sit on it for months or even multiple years, because if it sticks in my head for that long, then I know it's worth writing. I know I'm not going to lose interest before it's over because I want to see it done. So I guess with some of the ones on the Trello board where I had forgotten about them, that's a pretty good indication that maybe I don't need to think so hard about writing them anymore.
Yeah. And in a more serious note, when I'm in active writing mode, like Kyell said, if I'm trying to work on like a short story, that's something that I will conjure in my mind and try to write out fairly quickly. Or it's like, oh, I'll have an idea, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and then it's like, okay, like let's develop that, and then yeah, like I like ideally get to work on that very quickly. And I'm thinking here now, and just sort of doing this live about the one of the books in question that I'm supposed to be working on, like according to no one but me. But I'm like, okay, so like what do I still need? I'm like, okay, like I have the main characters, I have a setting, I have what the core conflict is, I know what the twist is, and I even know like sort of what the message is, but I don't know what the ending is. And so maybe I just need to write my way up to it to figure out what that is.
So you have the Keisho-ten, but not the Ketsu.
I do. I do not. I am out of Ketsu. I'm all out of Ketsu, which is very funny if you speak Japanese. Wink, wink.
Haha. Yeah, I've told the story before about how Price of Thorns started with an idea that I sent myself an AIM message about.
Wow, yeah.
And that was in 2009 or 10 or something, and it came out last year. I have another fantasy
My
book.
jaw's starting to crumble to dust as you're speaking.
Yeah, right. I have another fantasy book that I've had the idea for definitely since before COVID, because I took it to one of the writing retreats that I went to. So probably that was 2017 or 18, I want to say. Maybe 17. And that one, I've started a couple of the scenes and I've written the structure out, and I'm still really invested in it. I still really like it. So it's going to happen. It just has to get into the schedule somewhere.
I'm so caught up in this conversation that for a hot second there, I forgot we were recording the podcast, and I almost blurted out something super personal. So you can hold on to that one, listeners, and wonder what that means.
I'm wondering what that is. So
if you guess what it is, KM will record your answering machine message or voicemail message. So I think this kind of ties into the craft book I'm writing. I think my suggestion or my advice would be start planning out the idea, do an outline, do your pitch, think through the world, think through the setting, go through all of that before you start writing it. Because if you get bored in the middle of that, then probably not worth spending a year trying to write that as a novel. And B, if it does keep your interest, then you have a lot of supporting structure for when you do start writing it. And I don't know, take as long as it takes. It's one of those things where I think with experience you can feel whether something's going to be an exciting project or not. And for me, part of that is how long does it stick in my head? Because I have a schedule. So, right now I have 2 novel manuscripts that I'm trying to revise, and I have a couple novella-length things that I would like to write. So I don't have room to write a novel until probably next year. So if these ideas stick around until I have time to write them, then they're going to be worth writing.
Remember, you only have so much brain.
That's true.
All right. Thanks. One last question.
Our last question comes from TJ Mind, who writes, tossing out a more general question, do you have any struggles or awkward feelings writing characters X years younger than you? I know most of my characters are in their 20s, and I'm currently in my mid-30s, and it just makes me wonder. Also, when writing younger characters, do you ever worry you're missing some colloquialism / turn of phrase? Or do you just pretend your contemporary works are set in the period of your 20s?
I know how to stick out my gat for the Rizzler.
Jesus Christ. I think this ties
Paying
in.
the phantom tax. Being all skibbity.
Man, that is the most sus thing you've said.
Oh,
This ties in, I think, with our previous conversation about using vernacular and jargon in stories.
yeah.
So if you're using colloquialisms for a certain age group, the story is either not going to age well or it's going to become a period piece.
Yeah.
So I think using a couple of them in there is okay, because like now if you read a story and someone says, "Oh, gag me with a spoon," you're like, "Oh man, I remember when people used to say that."
Gosh, wow.
And I'm sure when you when you say skivity, some people will be like, "Oh, I remember when people used to say that."
Oh, KM.
But I don't usually worry too much about using the words of the Utes.
The Utes. 2 Utes.
And and then that was the second part of your question. And the first part, I think I mostly rate characters who are younger than me, with the exception of the Tiny Desires. And I think it's the reason that I rate characters younger than me is I remember what it was like to be
Yeah.
at that point in my life. And so I feel like I can see the decisions I made and the reasons I made them with a little more clarity of hindsight. But I'm still trying to puzzle my way through the age I am now. So I'd rather write about earlier points in on my timeline where I feel like I've been through that. I've had that experience. Let me tell you guys what it was like.
Also, let me make myself young and sexy again. Hooray. Oh, God.
Or just leave out the again.
Yeah. Oh, like, when in the question, it asks, like, or do you just have, like, all of your stories set back when you were in your 20s? And I'm just thinking about that. I'm like, oh, the early 2000s. No, thank you. Like, we were a desert of culture. Everyone was super sad about 9/11. Like, no.
Yeah, the 90s weren't that much better. Everyone was happy, but
Yeah, but it was like, it was a fake happy.
it was
Like,
like the
I
Paramore
remember
song.
when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was happening, and I'm like, this feels like a compromise we shouldn't be okay with, but I don't know enough to say for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And the answer was yes, it was a compromise that we shouldn't have been okay with. But it was also the 90s, and it was all we got.
Right. But I usually try to set things. I guess this is where the conflict would come in. If I'm writing in a contemporary world, I try to set things in the present day because I'm lazy and I don't want to remember when things were invented. I don't want to be like do a period piece from the 90s and have to remember I got a cell phone in the 90s, I'm pretty sure, but it was clunky. There wasn't an internet, but there was email. Well, there was an internet. There wasn't a World Wide Web really until kind of the mid to late 90s. And I remember using early browsers. I remember before domain names. I remember when domain names came out and I was like, "Oh, that makes it much easier to find a website. You don't have to just know the numbers and type them in."
I don't need to boot up Telnet anymore.
Oh my god, Telnet was such a pain in the ass. But so I think where the conflict comes in is I set things in the current day, and the experience of a 20 or 30-year-old in the current day is not necessarily my experience in the current day.
Yeah.
But I do read a lot about people's experiences, and I'm pretty good at extrapolating and interpolating.
In the ongoing saga that is One Piece, which has been going on for over 20 years at this point, things like the concept of streaming like has arisen in the real world since this is began. So I was like, okay, yeah. And it's like, there's a One Piece version of streaming now so that you can have like a streaming idol as like a character. And it's like, yeah, we go ahead and they've invented that now, which is extra funny
Cool.
because all of the telecommunications devices in One Piece are snails. Like they're alive. And it's like, and this is a snail that can just broadcast a screen image from somebody like thousands of miles away. It's like, yeah, sure, okay.
Wow.
Let's go with that.
Yeah, definitely. Cell phones are the one thing that always pops up as we watch old stuff
Oh yeah.
to modern day. It's like so many storylines would not even work with cell
Yeah,
phones.
there's a whole trope of like movies that would be over in 5 minutes if cell phones existed.
I was seeing a thing earlier where it was like, wait, like, but if we have this lockdown like going on, I was like, are we supposed to just leave our kids home alone unsupervised for several hours a day? And it's like, yeah, that wasn't that weird when our parents did it to us. And it's just like, that's just a cultural shift. It's like, oh God, who would leave their children home alone? And it's like, I would come home, I was like, yeah, go ahead, make dinner, like get stuff done, make sure you do your homework. I was like, all right, yeah.
Yeah, talk to
Fine.
some latchkey kids.
Yeah.
All right, we have migrated into Grey Wolf, Grey Muzzle podcast here.
We have.
I think I will summarize real quick.
how good you had it.
And just say that I think Corey Wolfhart had it correct in regards to like culture peaked in the 80s. I think we can all agree to that.
Yeah.
God damn it.
And we'll go from there. All right. So these were great answers.
I also sometimes have my characters be old enough to be aware of vernacular, but not how to use it properly. And so, which is exactly how I am. So that one's easy for me to write. And then I can write things in and say, I think people are saying Riz now, but I don't know what that means. Am I rizzing right now?
Am I rizzing right now? Am I a Sigma?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'll end it on my side and say this is a great opportunity for folks to read the works of younger generations as well, because that also will give you insight as to what's going on in their heads and their world. Sorry, that was not a great transition, but I'm going to use it, and then I'm going to sign out myself. Thank you, everyone. This was Kyell. Keep talking on your side.
I was K.M. Hirosaki, purveyor of mistruths and lies.
And I have been Kyell Gold, formerly young Fox.